hell of an actor, Laughlin. Who is acting? Well, he's still alive, aren't you?
I think we saw this primarily as an action film. This is the whole thing. I have this argument I say all the time. There's no such thing as an action movie. Because this whole category of an action movie was sort of invented by the studios in the 1980s. What happened was, Commando, in fact, was the first American movie to make more money overseas than it did domestically. It had never happened before. Whatever you make in America, if you're lucky, you'd make, 40, 50, maybe 60, 70% overseas with a big hit movie. So everyone decided action travels. You don't need to read the subtitles, in Czechoslovakia, when there was a Czechoslovakia, to know that you shouldn't kidnap Arnold's daughter.
Visita mi canal.
It defies translation. So a typical thing is, if you look at, I remember, this got to be 15, 16 years ago, there was a 2-page ad of a studio announcing all their movies coming out for the summer. And they put a category, comedy, drama, and then I see action. I see all these movies, like Godzilla was listed as an action movie. But it's a monster movie. But everyone called anything that had anything remotely, hectic, an action movie, because action movies travel. So even sci-fi movies are called action movies. So anyway, this was an action movie. That's what we thought we were making, even though obviously it's a science fiction film. It's a dystopic film. It's all that. We never really thought of as a horror movie, because while Stephen King is known as a horror writer, under his alias, Richard Bachman was more of a science fiction writer, it turned out. Because he did The Running Man, he did The Long Walk, which is a similar idea to The Running Man, only instead of making you fight to survive, you have to, marathon walk to survive. Another thing that would require translation for us, again, because Stephen King, writing in the 70s in Maine, sort of not understanding how the show business works, not only did he have this game show that was incredibly archaic, where, on screen, the idea was that the people who try to kill you are anonymous. They're called the hunters, but they're in disguise. So you can be walking down the street and the meter maid kills you. So that's an interesting idea for the novel, but in the movie, then you don't get to fall in hate with any bad guys. In other words, it's just like random people. Also, in order to get the money, if you win, every day you have to make a tape recording and mail it in to the studio. So we didn't have the internet when the movie came out, but we had bulletin boards. You could put video clips on a bulletin board. So the idea in the book that the person who was trying to stay alive, they give you a video camera and blank videotapes. And every day you have to send a videotape back to the studio to explain, well, I've been running now for 3 days. I got away from that fake ice cream man. And keep voting for me, fans, because for the audience. So the idea that you have this dystopic 1984 kind of society where the people on the show trust the government enough to postmark. I mean, you mail the thing, now they sort of know where you are, from the postmark. Plus, the game lasts 1 month. So Stephen King skips over the idea in the book that this TV show was on every day for a month in prime time, and has the possibility that nothing could happen for multiple days in a row, right? Because they have several people running, but nobody gets killed or has a fight every day. And there is no fighting. They can't. If they see you, they shoot you. So it just needed to be sort of reinvented to translate to the motion picture. So right away we said, okay, our cue is wrestling. We're going to make the hunters not anonymous. We'll call them stalkers, not hunters, because there's a TV show called Hunter at that time. And we'll make them bigger-than-life characters. And the TV show is not on for a month. It's on, I guess, once a week. And it's a 3-hour, 4-hour show. It dominates programming that night. That seems easier to understand, and that seems easier to put on its feet, and for the audience, watching the movie to sort of buy into it, and more importantly for the fictional audience to sort of believe, are they going to commit for a month? You know, it's sort of like before streaming was invented, you know. So nowadays you could actually do it. They say, we're going to give you a cell phone camera, and you could like send in your report every day, and we don't know where you are because you're, you know. So maybe in the remake, if they ever do the remake, we can update the movie by going backwards to some of the original ideas in the book. We'll become more futuristic by getting retro. So that's a decision we made down the line.
Oh, cut! Go to commercial! Jesus Christ! I have no power! Cut! Go to commercial!
I was welcome on the set, invited on the set, because there was a lot of last-minute changes and things going on. So very late in the movie, we were making some adjustments. We were making up some of the fake shows that were in the movie. Like you see clips of other TV shows the network has. We thought of those deep into the movie. A lot of the jokes came in very late. Like we're already filming, and we added like he had to split. I remember that's a joke that we came up on the set with.
What happened to Bazo?
He had to split.
Well, the idea was that Arnold works best with his, delivery and his wisecracks and his screen presence if he has foils. So whereas in the book, the character was completely by himself, they had other runners, and the show would say, well, let's check in on this victim. Let's check in on... And so presumably the show, which is on TV every day for a month, would cut from one person to the other, one videotape, they send it another. But for our purposes, we wanted everybody together so they can work together, they can team up, so they can have friction, and so on. So coming off of Commando, they said there was a lot of fun with a woman who's a foil, so we were looking for somebody. The first thing was tall, because, in other words, there were a lot of actors that would just look, you cannot constantly, if you notice, all the people he runs with are tall. Because in an action movie, it's one thing to make an adjustment for height. Like, for example, people insist that Sicily, in Sicily, there's still trenches where they made Sophia Loren walk next to Alan Ladd on a movie called Boy and a Dolphin, to get their heights. If you're just talking to each other, you can stand on a box. But when you're walking, you have to make like a little boardwalk or dig a hole. So in an action movie, they didn't want to do that. So it sounds silly, but one of the considerations was how tall are the other three people he's running with. And Maria just, had a lot of sass and energy, and they just thought she brought a lot to the table with her attitude, and it shows on the screen.
Me and my big mouth. We should have taken that trip to Hawaii.
I had the shirt for it, but you fucked it up.
Jesus Christ.
Guess again.
For the Stalkers, we were just kind of spitballing, wrestling villains. And in fact, we have some pre-production art that sort of resembles them, but they sort of changed a little bit. Like I think Buzzsaw was originally called Chainsaw. Big change. We had a character who was, I'm trying to remember. There were several that got abandoned that were too much like wrestlers, too much. I think there was a Russian one. And then we decided, is that still going on, the Russian bad guy? And Ron Cobb, who did a lot of production design for the first Star Wars movie, designed a lot of creatures. He did pre-production artwork. And you can see the evolution of the Stalkers through the pre-production art, that some of them survived, some of them did not. And the idea was that they would always have some kind of gimmick, Now, I think the Buzzsaw was actually a combination of two characters. There was a character that we had Chainsaw, and then we had a character who was a cowboy. And I forget what his name was, Rawhide or Maverick or some kind of thing. And he was on a motorcycle and had a lasso. So I think the motorcycle and the lasso of sorts, I think, stayed, but he lost his country and western angle. Which is true because he was going to be playing country western music, and yet the country western music idea that the guy played country western music and sang he was a singing cowboy for 10 seconds, and that sort of got rolled over to Dynamo, and Dynamo was always Dynamo, an electric guy, but when the actor came in, he said, I'm an opera singer, and so we were already predisposed to have one guy, sing, so we did the opera singing. So it was really kind of a strange feedback of, it was art direction, screenwriter, director, and one of the actors contributing to who the stalkers were.
Are you ready for pain? Are you ready for suffering? If the answer is yes, then you're ready for Captain Freedom's workout.
Yes, it's America's own Captain Freedom.
We had a lot of fake commercials, and we only were able to get 2 or 3 of them into the movie. But if you listen to the soundtrack of the picture, particularly in the end credits, you hear the soundtrack of these other commercials we shot that we could not shoehorn into the movie. There's a commercial that amuses me a lot at the end for a Colchester. It was almost like the Purge. If you get the commercial, you listen to it. Guns for everyone in the family, even your youngsters. So it's sort of very Purge-like. So and some of the others we couldn't afford, like the Hate Boat is a poster. We actually had plans to go. No, we actually had plans to go to the Queen Mary and send a second unit. But like we weren't able to do it all. There's the Hate Boat. There's Climbing for Dollars. There's I Confess. I forget the names of the shows. When they walk down the hallways, you see posters for the fascinating programming on other channels. On their channel, I should say.
It's all over! What a colossal fight! This is an incredible moment in sports. Captain Freedom, out of retirement and still undefeated champion, proving once again that right and right.
One thing that I remember that's the most frustrating thing for me about the whole movie was, in the movie, as written, as shot, when they realize Arnold's killing everybody, and they're getting nervous, the government's on their case. The Department of Justice Entertainment Division is calling and yelling at the host of the show. We say, all right, desperate times call for desperate measures, says Richard Dawson. And then we cut to Arnold and Maria, and walls come down, they get trapped, and we had built up Captain Freedom as wanting to get back into the battle. And Captain Freedom jumps out and immediately, in the blink of an eye, kills Maria Conchita Alonso, snaps her neck. Now, we tested this in front of an audience on the halfway to Palm Springs, and the audience was stunned. They could not believe it. And now Arnold jumps on Captain Freedom and starts to beat the living crap out of him. And I remember distinctly this older woman. I mean, she was like, she had to be like in her 70s, and she says, "Kill the motherfucker! Kill the motherfucker!" So, and then to our astonishment, at the last minute, Captain Freedom turns the tables and throws Arnold onto a wall of spikes, and he's dead. And you cut to the audience in the movie, shocked. Our real audience is shocked. I was there. And now you go back to the studio. What a great finish! What a great finish. What a great battle. We'll see you next Wednesday, same time, same channel. God bless. They go off the air, and now he gets a phone call from the Department of Justice. Good job. And he turns to a technician, and he says, "Boy, that really worked." And the technician pushes a button, and you see the close-up of the dead Arnold, like lines go through it. It's some anonymous guy. He says, "That's great that CGI face changer thing was ready. We didn't have time to beta test." That fooled the audience. So we have this test screening, and they went insane in the sequence. Now we have test cards, and I come into work about 5 days after the test screening, and I see the editors are working on like the next to last reel. Like, what are you doing? He says, we're swapping scenes out. What are you talking about? We got an order to swap these 2 scenes. And what had happened, out of like maybe 600 people at the test screening, maybe 7 or 8 people said, "What does CGI mean? How did they fool the audience? What was that?" And of course, you got to remember, the test screening, it'll say shot missing. It says, like the picture where Arnold's face changes was black and white. It says, face change, right? So some studio executive says, "Oh, people don't understand that." And we're trying to like talk up the food chain, and I even got the cards, and I saw that every single person that did not understand it was older, which is probably younger than me now, but but I'd look at the card, I didn't understand how they changed faces. Why did you attend? Came with grandchild, it was every single one of them, And so I remember begging, say, don't you understand it? You were at the test screening. The audience went out of their minds when Arnold and Captain Freedom were fighting, right? Now, if you swap it backwards, they're going to be. It's like watching the replay of a tennis match. You know who won, and we just could not win that argument. And if you look at the movie today, if you listen to the dialogue and look at the close-ups, you can see that they cut away from Richard Dawson to the person listening to him because they had to have Dawson come back in and say, all right, I want you to use that face changing, get it ready, instead of saying, good thing that worked. So if you really want to see the movie as its best example, if you get this Blu-ray, you have the power of Blu-ray to like re-edit the movie, so put it back the way it was intended.
The capture of renegade police officer and mass murderer Ben Richards was filmed yesterday by runway security cameras. Richards' hostage, Amber Mendez, was unharmed. Some airport personnel were not so lucky, like the ticket agent and security guard Richards shot at point-blank range when he arrived at the airport.
But that's not true.
I was interested in how many reviews. One review I remember, I think it was the Washington Post or the New York Times, somebody said, was like really got into the political subtext. Is it possible that Arnold's wife, Maria Shriver, from a Democratic dynasty, is influencing him? Nah, that was what the review said. But I liked that people enjoyed the parody and the preposterousness of a reality television person, calling the shots in a country. Oh, that could never happen. And the fake news. When we got to the anniversary of the movie, which was a year ago, all of a sudden I started seeing these think pieces everywhere about has this movie come true, and it was like all over the world. It was in American newspapers and magazines, The Guardian in the UK, Australia. Everybody, it seemed like everybody had a think piece about how this movie predicted where we are now. To which I say, it's not my fault.
Then we'll broadcast the truth. Truth hasn't been very popular lately.
This film, I guess, cemented my standing as a go-to action movie guy because now we're 3 in a row that had a lot of action. 48 Hours, Commando, and The Running Man. 3 pictures in a row that had action with a lot of humor. But the humor I put in my films, it's not like the next day you can repeat it. So a big laugh in the movie is when Arnold says he had to split. But if you say the next day, wasn't that funny when he said he had to split? That's only funny in the movie because of the context. There's a line that gets a big laugh in Die Hard when Dwayne Robinson, the police chief, realized, they said the FBI is here, and he starts to button his collar, and Reginald Johnson, Officer Powell, says, do you want a breath mint? And the audience laughs because it sums up that the guy is, a jerk, and that our guy is critical. But again, it's a big laugh in the movie. It's out of context. It's not funny, and I think that's why, at least in my films, I think the humor works so well because it's not trying too hard. I'm not trying to tell a joke, in the movie. There's a big laugh in Street Fighter, which that's a story in itself. It got watered down to too much of a PG. But there's one point where Jean-Claude Van Damme is out of ammunition, and he comes through a doorway, and there's 30 bad guys. And he swallows, he takes out a knife, and they all back away. And he gets kind of cocky, and then you realize that 50 of his guys are coming behind him. So it's a legitimate joke, but you can't repeat it the next day at the dinner table. You have to set the table for that joke to work. So I would say this probably cemented things for me, and I think almost immediately after this was Die Hard, which was the same producers I'd done 48 Hours in Commando for. So we had a history.
Action cinema is a really interesting genre from the perspective that it is reflecting the political and cultural things that are going on in the 80s. And so certainly there had been action cinema before, but one of the things that characterizes 80s action cinema is an increasing ability to, after all the Star Wars franchises and things, to use big special effects big production values that you hadn't seen in earlier films that you could have characterized as action films. And so that opened up the span of the kinds of things that could be shown, the kind of spectacle. So in the sense of trying to define 80s action cinema as something really distinctive, I think it's the first time period that you saw really spectacular film and really focus on the idea of film as a spectacle, and not only from the perspective that spectacle is explosions and car chases, but also spectacle is bodies, spectacle is actions and movements as spectacle. So I think that's what characterizes 80s action cinema. Well, it's a really interesting question to think about where these 80s action films started. And certainly they do dip into some of the films in the 70s, but one of the first films that kicked off the popularity is a film like First Blood. And the interesting thing about First Blood is, of course, it was this low-budget film that nobody really thought was going to go anywhere. So if you start thinking about what characterizes 80s action films later, these big, spectacular, high-end, high-budget productions, and then you think about First Blood, you can't connect the two of them immediately because they don't seem to fit budget-wise or in terms of the kind of action content. But if you look at First Blood in terms of the ethos of the characters and the storyline that happens in First Blood, you really can tie what happens in the 80s back directly to that film. The story is about the anti-government activities, the strain about independence and heroism, about getting America back. All of those things that characterized 80s action films all came from First Blood.
Well, that hit the spot.
There was, I think, in the late 70s and early 80s in the United States, a crisis about national confidence because of the Vietnam War. The idea that the United States lost a war, which was unknown in the living memories of anybody alive in the United States, and certainly unfamiliar to the ethos of the United States that came out of the Second World War. The idea that this was the nation that was saving the rest of the world, that this was the generation that built industry, that built huge corporations, that dramatically expanded the nation's economy and the nation's reach in terms of imperialism and global power. That generation established itself on the backs of the fact that they had won the Second World War. And so for the children of that generation to experience a lost war is an unfathomable and psychologically difficult concept. And so for the nation as a whole, in terms of the character of the nation, there was this crisis of idea that we were not the strong, confident, overpowering and domineering nation that we had been as a result of the Second World War. So there was a strong impulse in the 80s films to recapture that feeling of success and heroism that came out of the Second World War and explain away the Vietnam War as a glitch, as a mistake, as something that we just didn't do quite properly, rather than a war that should have been telling us something about the nature of global relationships.
Now you got more. You've got talent, you've got charisma, and you got balls. And that's why I pulled a few strings to get you here.
Why is Arnold Schwarzenegger so incredibly popular? There's a stream of 80s action films, and not just action films, but 80s culture, where there's a strong emphasis on a self-made individual, right? This is the me generation. But if you also remember what else happened in the 80s, it's this huge growth of the athletic industry. What we now sort of take for granted, on every corner is some workout facility. But in the 80s, it really became the dance craze, the workout craze, where it was popular costume attire. Clothing manufacturers were making things that looked like workout gear, and it became a popular thing. There was a huge dominance of self-attention, self-manufacture, self-reverence, self-construction. And in some ways, it's very logical to think that a nation that was in crisis, trying to think about its identity, would turn to say, one of the ways that we can solidify this problem and stop the drift away from who we are is to focus on who we are. And so let's just make ourselves strong. Let's make ourselves good. And so in the midst of that kind of a craze, Schwarzenegger became incredibly popular, not only because he literally embodied that ethos, but because he captured everyone's imagination as a self-made man. And so I don't know that people were fascinated with him because he was attractive or because he was a heartthrob. I don't remember any women actually talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger as a film icon that they would swoon over. But people were captivated by the fact that he created himself. And in the fact of him creating himself showed a model for everyone else to say, well, if this man can come from nothing to a huge Hollywood star by making himself into that, then we, not only as individuals, but we as a nation, can create ourselves anew again. So I think people were attracted to him because he represented a possibility that each of us could follow if we had the same determination and the same toughness that he exhibited.
Mommy, let it go! Richard!
Hey! Right there! Hey, Christmas tree!
Richard!
Sylvester Stallone's popularity comes from a number of different places. One of the things, again, if you look at him as representing an ethos in the country, Sylvester Stallone became popular through the Rocky films. And the Rocky films were not only, again, embodying this idea that if you were determined enough, you could create yourself. And so in that sense, he's very like Schwarzenegger. That part of what made Schwarzenegger so successful was that people knew that as a person he had created himself. Stallone showed us in films individuals who created themselves, and that's what made him so heroic at the beginning, was that he acted out the story of how you make yourself anew. And the Rocky films were in some ways the iconic films of that message of how do you make yourself anew, how do you come from nothing and create yourself as a boxer, as a successful, strong man who can win in multiple ways. Win with the woman you love, win in the boxing ring, win with your family and your neighborhood, and win for your city. And so that feeling of, again, being sort of down at the bottom and not knowing what to do, Stallone pulled himself out of that, and in following his story, he pulls us out of that. And so that, to me, is what made Stallone so successful, is that he constantly found characters that he could play who pulled themselves up out of nothing and made themselves something. And again, that same sort of story of self-realization and self-actualization, but he did it in a way that was far more informed by explicit class issues. Arnold Schwarzenegger was not about class issues, right? He was an immigrant. He actually wanted to deny class issues in his own self-creation. But Stallone was very much conscious about class issues, coming from a working class neighborhood in Philadelphia and having nothing, and then creating himself out of that. So one of the things I actually admire a lot about Stallone is that he kept this consciousness about class. And of course, class is the issue in America that we talk about all the time and that we never talk about. And the idea of class as you can pull yourself up from nothing, rather than class as that you're constrained into certain kinds of preset and predetermined areas, because actually there is a pretty clear class system in the United States. So Stallone talked about class in ways that were both evocative of I can pull myself up out of nothing, but also showed the pain of having been resigned to a class issue. So many of his friends in the Rocky films are people who can't get out of that neighborhood. And there's a realization about what that class imprisonment really is in the United States. And I think a lot of people resonated with Stallone for that reason. And I think he became extraordinarily evocative for a lot of Americans in that kind of ethos, which he carried into so many other films that he played.
You cold-blooded bastard. I'll tell you what I think of it. I live to see you eat that contract. But I hope you leave enough room for my fist, because I'm going to ram it into your stomach and break your goddamn spine!
I think it's really interesting to try to distinguish between the film's narratives and the film's characters and actors when you're trying to interpret the way that they get understood by audiences, by film audiences. So if you look at another film like Commando and you have an actor like Schwarzenegger, it's very hard for Schwarzenegger, given his character by that time in Hollywood, to be an anti-government figure. So you have this interesting tension in that film between what the film is saying. You're fighting off Contras. Well, who were the Contras and who was supporting the Contras? And aren't you actually making a critique about Reagan's political and geopolitical issues? But then you have Schwarzenegger in there as an actor who is so dominating as a film presence that it's hard for you not to just look at him. His body is a spectacle because he built it that way, he intended it that way. His whole persona was created as a very self-designed, intentional spectacle. And it's very hard to not look at him and associate with him the other films that he's made, the character that he's created, and a very strong conservative politics that everybody kind of knows about by that time.
He's the butcher of Bakersfield.
Come on, Mick. You can see through that crap. It's network propaganda.
We don't know that.
We know we wouldn't be here if he hadn't helped us.
We also know he's not one of us.
There is a complete lack of women as prominent in these action films in the 80s. And I think a lot of that is still because part of these films are coming out of a very militarized culture. We never demilitarized in the United States from the Second World War. It is a very strong military narrative that runs throughout the culture. And I think that there was, because of that, a very difficult acceptance about women continuing to be in this action role because it bled over so quickly into a military role. And the country was going through this
Visita mi canal.
Issue in the 80s of trying to figure out how to move forward with the military at all after the Vietnam War. The debate about all-volunteer army, conscription army, and the idea of an all-volunteer army, including women, was a point of an extraordinary crisis for people in terms of gender identification in this country. Not only gender identification in the roles of women, but also more pointedly, I think, gender identification in the roles of men and the roles that men have in culture. If women are in the military, what spaces are left for men to inhabit that are exclusive to them? And so I think that the lack of resolution about that debate made it very difficult for women to be seen as equally potential action figures.
Where did you hide that?
It's none of your business.
There is so much that we can be offended by today in these films of the 80s. And there is, when I teach these films and I show them to typically college-age students today, they look at them and they say, how did you tolerate the way they talk about women? How did you tolerate the way they talk about race? How did you not see that? And so young people today look at these films and I have to look at them and go, wow, that's pretty embarrassing. And yet at the time, they weren't talked about. So many of the popular films, if you try to teach a film like MASH, which was extraordinarily popular, with left-wing critiques, abundant in that film in the 70s, and people who thought of themselves as so politically progressive and so politically astute, and didn't see the rampant sexism in that film. And if you look at it now, people look at it and say, how could we have tolerated that? So there's a lot of interesting, unrecognized, not that people didn't see it at the time, but they didn't see it as prominent as a piece of the narrative. And for people who did point it out, it was like, well, but wait, there's this larger important thing that this film is doing, right? So there is a lot of tension in those films in the 80s, those action films, a lot of issues around race and ethnicity that are suppressed in the films, that erupt in really interesting, problematic moments repeatedly throughout the films. Remo Williams. Would we accept today that Joel Grey could play a Korean character? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And yet, in that film, he was nominated for all kinds of awards for this extraordinary acting performance. So there's a different kind of cultural environment in terms of thinking about some of the statements, the representations, the personas, the actors in films in the 80s that would not, I think, quite happily, we would not find those acceptable today.
Now I'm going to untie you, and then you're gonna get dressed, and then you're gonna come with me.
Oh, yeah? Well, why should I?
Because I'm going to say, please.
Well, why didn't you say so?
Well, there is a lot of really interesting work that was done on homoeroticism in these films, and it is not hard to see. The buddy nature of so many of these films, where, again, Lethal Weapon is probably one of the finest examples. If you look at the end of the first Lethal Weapon film, when there's that wonderful inability to tell who actually pulls the trigger right there at the end, but they're wrapped up around each other in this embrace that is both protective and affectionate at the same time, and they joke about it and talk about it, and wait a second, we're not kissing, wait a second, we're not really lying here together in this bathtub, get off of me. There's such a self-awareness about it at the same time that the movies show it over and over and over again. So there's this incredible hypocrisy and tension and duplicity about homoeroticism and men's relationships with each other in these films. The early films of the 80s are far more individual, single men. When Rocky gets into that ring, I don't care how many friends he has, he's in that ring by himself. But if you look at the Lethal Weapon films and these buddy films that you start to see in the end of the 80s and into the 90s, there is this sense of men experiencing this kind of crisis together and supporting themselves through this crisis together and bonding with each other in this crisis together. And it's a fascinating moment in American film cinema because, of course, for the bulk of the history of American cinema, anything that you could think of as action films going back to the Westerns, these are the lone gunmen. They are the lone heroes. It's the Shane riding off on the horse all by himself. So it's really these buddy films that you start to see in the late 80s and 90s. It's almost, it's not quite unique, but it's a really distinctive feature that happens at that time that you didn't see in earlier kind of action films. And it's signaling about the country that, again, there is this re-examination of men's roles with each other, the idea that men have to be the sort of strong, single characters who cannot converse with each other is being taken up in these films in a way that is both serious, and of course you have to be joking because you can't be totally serious that you're bonding with other men, and working out a lot of these anxieties through a sense of irony and a sense of humor, and then of course using a lot of physical violence, because anybody who gets too close too seriously you have to expel and treat with repulsive violence.
Listen, we're counting on you. Don't let us down. I don't want to be the only asshole in heaven.
I think Lethal Weapon and the Die Hard series, and certainly the Die Hard series is still going on in some ways, so it's hard to, you don't want to look at the entirety of that, but certainly the Die Hard films that were made during that time period, they both brought to them, unlike the Stallone films, this character of someone who is clearly, you know, one of the toughest heroic figures that you can find, in ways that I find really fascinating to look at the kind of body heroism they have. I mean, Stallone's heroism, physical adeptness and heroism, was really about strength. His gutsiness, you know, in the First Blood film when he sews himself up and, you know, does surgery on his own wounds. And there's a kind of gritty toughness about his body strength and his physicality. But when you get to Die Hard and Lethal Weapon, you have two actors in Mel Gibson and Bruce Willis who are not themselves big, buff characters. And so they don't have that same kind of physicality. And at the same time, they undergo extraordinarily gruesome and painful experiences with their bodies. When Bruce Willis has to walk over glass, broken glass, with bare feet, Mel Gibson gets just pummeled by opponents in Lethal Weapon when his shoulder gets dislodged and he has to pop it back in. I mean, just gruesome things that happen to their bodies in ways that make them more vulnerable in a way that Stallone or Schwarzenegger never really were. And that kind of vulnerability that enters in the Lethal Weapon and the Die Hard films signals the end of that 80s action era. It's a beginning of a transition to the 90s films where male figures, especially any kind of male action figures, had a much stronger kind of vulnerability about them. Even in some sense is a kind of femininity of a character to them. And so both Mel Gibson and Bruce Willis really are on the cusp of that transition from the 80s action films into this kind of more vulnerable role that men were taking on in the 90s films.